It's a great pleasure to see you again for the Krasno event series. As you know, I'm Klaus Lares. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm very pleased to welcome Ross Delston today. He is our distinguished speaker, and I'm also very pleased to see such a large crowd. We have a good contingent from Fort Bragg. We have many loyalists, and we even have a birthday child here today. Someone is celebrating his birthday, and before going off for a family dinner in a nice restaurant, he decided to come and join us for our event today. I think this requires an applause. So happy birthday. I think that is a first. So it's great to see you again. Today, as I said, Ross Delston is here. And I would like to remind you, before I will talk about Ross, to sign up to our mailing list, to look at our YouTube channel, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC, and also not forget that we have a website, krasnoevents.com. Please keep all that in mind. Today, Ross Delston has decided to join us. Ross is a Washington-based attorney and expert witness. And Ross and I go back 10 years or something like that. We met at an event in Washington, D.C., and we have stayed in touch ever since. I've enjoyed his intellectual conversation for a long time now, and I thought it was about time that he came to Chapel Hill and told us all about his expertise. And his expertise is in money laundering and international corruption cases. He also was a bank regulator, but he has now focused since the last 10, 20 years, I would say, on money laundering in particular. He has been an expert witness for the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. He has also done consultancy work for the World Bank and for many other organizations. He's frequently quoted in leading newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and others. And he gives many speeches and talks all over the world, and all of them, most of them, deal with money laundering and related issues. I would like to say, before I hand over to Ross, I would like to say this is not a lecture about how to do it. I have the suspicion that some of you might be here in order to learn how to do money laundering. That is not what it is all about. Just to, make clear that you know what you're here for. But please join me now in welcoming Ross Delston from Washington, D.C.
So we've got the slide presentation, do we?
Yes. Press it, yeah.
I should tell you that I got into the money laundering field, anti-money laundering field, I should say, through my work at the IMF. And through that work, I discovered the value of one Michael Jordan. This all came together in my first IMF mission in 1997 in Zagreb, Croatia. And as I entered the city, I see this larger-than-life poster of Michael Jordan, known as Michael in Croatia. Some of you might remember the center on some of those winning teams, Toni Kukoc from Croatia. So I always wondered why he got paid so much for endorsements before I went to Zagreb. When I left Zagreb, I wondered why he wasn't paid more. And he has some kind of association with UNC, I understand. Is that right? Including a degree. Now, I've been accused of forcing pictures of my grandchildren on my audiences. I would never, captive audiences, I would never, through captive audiences, require people to see pictures of my four grandchildren. That would be really unfair. So we're here to talk about corruption and money laundering, but with a focus mainly on money laundering. Corruption's been with us. We'll talk about it. It's part of the human condition. The species, Homo sapiens, and the U.S. in particular is a great venue for money laundering, the fruits of corruption, for a lot of reasons. So there's a little bit of good news here that USA is still a good place to invest money. The US dollar is still the reserve currency. And everybody wants a stable store of value. The euro, not quite as good in terms of stability, and no really third currency yet. And the political system, we're not going to talk in detail about political system. We're not going to talk about corruption in the U.S. to any great degree because it's so contentious and so tribal that I think it takes us away from the main point. Except to say that it's still viewed in relative terms as a stable country with a stable system and therefore a good place to invest. So again, good news. Not so good news, open doors, open windows, great place to launder money. Not enough controls on money coming in because after all, everybody wants money to be invested here. Everybody has a stake in the money getting invested. So don't ask too many questions. And then on top of that, that's the normal tendency for every financial system, every legal framework. On top of that, you have large components of our system untouched by basic anti-money laundering rules, purposefully, consciously untouched at least since 2001. USA Patriot Act, where everything was reformed, everything was possible to be reformed from an anti-money laundering standpoint, and yet lawyers still not covered. The international standard is lawyers are covered by these same rules that banks have. Real estate agents still not covered. They say it's not necessary. They point to the banks as the first line of defense. Well, we shouldn't just lock our doors and windows. We have a security system, and we leave lights on, and we ask our neighbors to watch our houses. We don't rely on one line of defense, nor should we in this case. So the flow of corrupt funds really unabated. And the closest I can come to explaining this in pictures is driving through Death Valley. It's just pictures I found on the internet in a convertible with the top down and the air conditioning blasting. And it's just not going to be very effective. So we have very good controls in some ways on banks. So we've got a very robust law enforcement system, and the banking regulators do a pretty good job, and yet large components untouched. The UK, the United Kingdom, does a much better job of including all of the required elements in its system. Which brings us to corruption. What I like about the definition is there's not just negative in the way that we think of for this talk, which is corrupting of government officials, doing bad things, taking money they shouldn't, stealing money from their own coffers, but there's a sense of decay and decomposition as part of the definition. So in other words, it's bad in so many ways. And when I travel to other countries, I always tell them that we in the United States don't have corruption. And they look at me in wonderment. And I say, yes, we don't have corruption. We have something called campaign finance, but not corruption. Now, so that's the definition of corruption. It's taking money that isn't yours, government officials, getting bribed. We'll talk about some of the cases very briefly because they're all over the place outside the United States, not to talk about our system, unless forced to, and even then, not willing. And the idea of money laundering is it's always the fruits of a crime. It's always profits from a crime. There has to be an underlying crime first. So taking the money that isn't yours from the sovereign wealth fund and siphoning it off and putting it into the U.S. We have a case like that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Always the source of it is illegal money, as opposed to taking money you've earned from your business and putting it someplace else because you don't want your kids to know how much money you have. That's not illegal. Taking your money during the divorce and hiding it probably is illegal. So how do you do that? You have to move it around, you have to disguise it, you have to conceal it, and you use the formal financial system to do that, banks and money services businesses and broker-dealers. That's one way. And then you can also carry the cash across borders. Bulky, unpleasant, you worry about somebody stealing it, you worry about dogs sniffing out the cash because it has a certain smell to it, the smell of money. And then there's trade-based money laundering, pretending there's a trade transaction when there isn't, overcharging for something as a way of moving money in, undercharging as a way of moving money out of the country. Three main ways to do it. Charlie's first solid meal. Very confused by it, as you can see. I think it was carrots, but it could be sweet potatoes. So corruption all over the world. Just a few examples. I happened to look at the newspaper in like a 1 or 2 day period, and I see El Chapo giving $1 million to Honduras president's brother of Iran's president sentenced to prison for corruption. Different last name, very important, because you want people with different last names than the people stealing the money, because then they're not associated with that person. The brother-in-law of the president of Mexico. Different last name. Perfect. And yet you can trust him or her. Iraqis protesting against corruption. And Israelis undergoing trials for corruption. So very hard to stop if it's happening everywhere except this country. And it's all coming in here. Really, really hard to stop. This massive flow. Everybody talks about sipping from a fire hose. That's the standard cliche. But try taking a teaspoon and scooping some of that water out from the fire hose and saying you've done something. How much water is coming out? We don't know. We don't know how much money is being laundered in the U.S. It's a crime. How do you count it? It's not being declared. Nobody has a good count on any of it. On the money being stolen abroad, on the money being laundered here in the U.S. Very hard to find. So I call one of my daughters, and she happens to have a PhD in biology, which is relevant to this story. And I ask Rachel, I need a picture of the kids with red flags. And this is what she sends me. So I call her, Rachel, I asked for red flags. These are orange. Dad, this is all we had. Okay. Red flags are a key part of what I do. They are potential indicators of money laundering and other crime. Potential suspicious activities. Not actual, we don't know, but certain patterns to the way money is laundered. So banks known to be high risk for financial crime, that's one way one red flag for money laundering. Use of limited liability companies and offshore financial centers, the usual suspects in the Caribbean, the Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey, Gibraltar. They're all nice places. I've been to a lot of them for the IMF, really nice places. Why would you want to put your money someplace that you don't want to visit. You want your money not only safe, but you want it comfortable. And you want to be comfortable when you visit it. You can use nominees or third parties like your brother-in-law to stand between the corrupt person and the person on the other side, the bank, where you want to put the money. And sovereign wealth funds are a great way to steal money because everything's in one place. Really interesting case. I was not involved in this case, but it is similar to a case I was involved in. And it's called U.S. versus the Wolf of Wall Street. Why would it be called that? It's a civil case, civil forfeiture, not criminal. Why would it be called U.S., that's us, versus a piece of property? Because the way the civil forfeiture laws work in the U.S., the lawsuit is against the property, not against the owners. It's against the property itself. And the property in this case was a pretty good movie, I thought, The Wolf of Wall Street. And it involved the Prime Minister of Malaysia taking hundreds of millions of dollars through a friend of his stepson, family friend Joe Low, and it eventually resulted in that same Prime Minister Najib being defeated because word got out. And then the money was funneled all over the world, some of it through the British Virgin Islands, and eventually used to buy real estate in the U.S. and a lot of other things. A lot of other things. A lot of money. Investigation's still ongoing all over the place. So again, a civil forfeiture action, people get confused about civil versus criminal. Civil is all about money. People talk about justice in a civil case. It's not about justice, it's about money. Getting money for the U.S. that was wrongfully taken from somebody else. And in this case, one of the properties that was purchased with this money was a hotel I stayed in, very nice hotel, L'Hermitage in Beverly Hills. And I remember it because I was on the phone with my wife at the time. This was 25 years ago. I was working for a law firm. And she's complaining about having cold beans for dinner. The kids are not feeling well. And I said, excuse me, there's a knock on my door. I think my room service meal's being delivered. And I came back to the phone and said, you don't have to eat cold beans. We have a microwave. So that's L'Hermitage. Very nice hotel. What's interesting about this case, they really went first class. These are all places that Joe Low used to himself become a celebrity because he had all this money to spend, and therefore he became an important person, and it was seemingly unlimited. Other people's money, OPM. Really good way. So eventually the case was settled for $60 million. Again, civil forfeiture cases, not about justice. They're about money. $60 million, pretty good take for money that didn't belong to the person spending it. So the property was taken by the U.S. So imagine this is one case, one country, one moment. $700 million that is estimated to have been stolen, and yet only $60 million recovered. Considered a big win by U.S. standards. It's a lot of money, and yet what? Less than a tenth of the total that was stolen. One case, one country. Not particularly the largest country. Malaysia's well enough off, but it's not Switzerland. It's not, doesn't have huge flows of oil. It's not a petrodollar country. So you get an idea of the scope of the problem. And yet, very hard to solve. So why do I always have this slide in all of my presentations, the Hindenburg disaster? I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember stories of this. I heard stories when I was a kid. It was a major event, 1937, solid air dirigible, the high point of German technology at that time, filled with hydrogen gas, highly flammable, caught fire, to this day not clear why. People jumping from the gondola, 37 or so people died. Why do I have this slide? Some of you are also old enough to remember it was the cover of the first album of Led Zeppelin, 1969. Big event in itself in my life, that album. But it also is because you can see these things coming. We know there's corruption overseas. We know there's money laundering in the US. We know we have open doors and windows. We think it's a bad thing that they come here with this money. We say we want to stop it, and yet it goes on. Should we be surprised that it continues? I don't think so. I found this quote after going through my father's papers after his death, and a little card that he had clipped to his refrigerator. It's been attributed to Santayana, also to Albert Einstein. He attributed it to Santayana, an American philosopher. Education is what remains when everything you learned in school has been forgotten. And the reason I have it is that I graduated from law school a long time ago. A lot of my clients were not born when I graduated in 1976. But one of the few things I remember is Latin, cui bono. So who benefits? Who benefits by not having real estate agents subject to these rules, not having lawyers subject to these rules, not having hedge funds, private equity funds, investment advisors subject to these rules in the US? They are subject to these rules in the European Union. They are subject to these rules under international standards that the US says it subscribes to, but not covered by the US framework. Quite a coincidence. Real estate agents, great lobby. They're all over the place. Lawyers, their lobby is called Congress. I mean, how many Congress people and senators are lawyers? Most of them. So, I mean, I've watched friends of mine, their blood pressure goes up in front of my eyes when I say to them, don't you think there should be customer due diligence that lawyers are required to follow before they take a client? They should ask where the source of wealth comes from. Oh, I worry about them. I mean, these are not young people. So we know who benefits. And we know in these cases that specific groups of people benefit. And we know that whenever property is purchased, somebody legally gets a commission, legally gets funds generated from the legal work, legally gets a title search. All of these things are legal, so who would want to stop it? It's just too good to stop. The good news is that although it's hard to stop, there's a greater awareness today than ever before. I think partly due to the internet, partly due to the proliferation of information, partly because it's harder to hide these kinds of things. And once the word gets out, it isn't just relying on traditional newspapers and TV and radio outlets that are often controlled by the government in other countries. Not so much here. Here they're controlled by billionaires. In other countries, by the state. So therefore the news doesn't get out as well, but the internet has everything. Harder to stop. And also easier to organize demonstrations, easier to organize protests. Countries live in great fear of flash mobs, people organized through text messages. Overnight. Indonesia. Overnight, Suharto was swept away. Students demonstrating, police refusing to fire on them, and the regime was gone. I asked a Chinese official once, didn't he worry about exactly that sort of thing in China, happening in the People's Republic of China? And he said, Indonesia? No, small country. Soviet Union, that's what we worry about. I said, what? He said, breakup. Breaking the country into smaller pieces. Another international trend is everybody wants their own place. Not just the Kurds, but East Timor. Tiny places want to control their own destiny. So that's another international trend that is going on at the same time as corruption and money laundering. Not particularly good. My other daughter teaches philosophy, and this is the motto of her department. So there might not be any bad questions, but there certainly will be bad answers. And Klaus is going to ask some questions, and I'm going to give the answers. And I hope all of you will be asking questions as well. And we'll move to a different phase of this presentation.
Thank you very much.
What do we do now?
Yeah, we go to.
Thank you, Ross. That was most interesting. And what you said about the property market made me think the London property market is still exploding. Why would anyone mind if all that Russian money buys up expensive property and pays the state probably a lot of taxes, benefits wealthy people in Britain who could sell this property? So what actually is economically wrong with all that money coming from dubious sources into London, for example?
Well, it's interesting you should mention London because the UK has done more to stop this flow than most countries. And there's a lot of worries that go with the money. When the money starts flowing in, the people who own the money want some control over it. And the extreme cases you would find in places like Colombia a few years ago with the narcotraficantes, and today in Mexico with the cartels running amok. Bad things come with that money. That's one reason. Yes, it weakens countries like Russia and China where the money is flowing from, but that's not good for our economies in the long run. That's stealing from one place, from the people in one country, and benefiting much wealthier countries. Mm-hmm. And the English, the British, are doing much more than most countries. As a matter of fact, they passed their own civil forfeiture law that is very, very tough to go after a lot of this property. And they're also concerned about some of the Russian activities in England itself, some of the assassinations and assassination attempts that they've experienced recently. And again, it all goes together.
Thank you. Though I said this is not a how-to-do course, but put us through the stages. Let's say if I was a wealthy Russian oligarch who has, let's say, 100 million to play with, and I want to get it out of Russia, or at least most of it out of Russia, to invest it somewhere where I have the money for my old age if I have to flee the country. How would I go about it? Because that is money which cannot be easily moved in an unnoticed way. People would notice, wouldn't they, with that sort of amount of money?
Well, you wouldn't move it all at one time. It has to be done in stages. Again, real estate is always a good way to do it. And real estate has another advantage, which is that you can actually live in it, or it can be rented out. It's an asset that generates benefits. It often appreciates, so real estate is good. You want to keep up your lifestyle, so you want planes and cars and fancy works of art, and you want to find a bank, preferably in another country, that will be willing to work with you. Probably not a US bank today, not an English bank today, but a bank in a country that doesn't ask as many questions. And then from that bank, you move the money to a correspondent bank in a country like the US or the UK where you're going to spend the money. And then once you move it to that second bank, it's open season. Nobody asks any questions. Certainly not the real estate agents or the lawyers. In the 1MDB case, one feature of it that was particularly interesting, which is another way to launder money, but public, so I can talk about it. And again, I was not involved with that case. The Malaysian Joe Low, who was allegedly siphoning off the money, put a very large retainer in a US law firm in New York. Retainers are normal for big clients. You know, we will pay you a lump sum and you will put it in a special account, and then you will deduct from that special account the money that we, the client, owe you, the law firm. But the Malaysians did something different. They said, we funded this big retainer account in New York, but we'd like you to buy some property for us. You, the law firm, to buy the property. Now, what should have happened was the law firm says, we'd really love to help you, but we're not in the business of buying property. We will wire the money back to you, and you can use that money to buy the property yourself. But of course, that's not what the Malaysians wanted to do, because then their name would be on the property. They wanted the law firm to be, in effect, the intermediary, the nominee for the illicit funds. So there are lots of ways to do it. It's not hard to find willing lawyers. 60 Minutes did a great documentary on this that you can watch that's available on the internet. They went to lawyers with a fake client, and they asked them, will you help us take money out of our country, and implied that this was corrupt funds. And most of the lawyers fell all over themselves to help out. It was a real low point for the legal profession. One lawyer who was notable because he said he couldn't take it, the account, and when they asked him to recommend somebody, he said he couldn't. And he looked to me to be a solo practitioner like myself. And I thought it was interesting that it was a solo practitioner who said no, who in theory would need the client more than any of the bigger law firms, and yet he was able to say no, whereas the law firms weren't. And why weren't they? Because again, commissions, money coming in, don't ask too many questions, don't discourage. So there are plenty of people who will help you, not just in the US, but around the world.
So what you're saying is that if we want to end money laundering, we need to re-educate the lawyers.
Shoot. I don't believe in those sorts of training camps and any kind of, well, let's leave it at that. It's hard to do. We need to have these anti-money laundering rules in place for lawyers. What's interesting is the lawyers, the first objection is, are there any lawyers in the audience? You can admit it, there are a few people here.
They don't dare to show their hands.
Nothing to be ashamed of, I'm a lawyer. The first thing the lawyers say is legal privilege prevents us from filing a suspicious activity report that reports on our client. Well, that's true if the matter is subject to privilege. But the matters we're talking about are commercial transactions, and there are always third parties involved, and often what goes on is not subject to privilege. In fact, the UK has done a very good job. The City of London, the financial center, I talked to a group of them 10 or 15 years ago, well, 15 years ago, and very willing to, they didn't like the rules, but they were willing to follow them. And the privilege concept in the US comes from the UK, yet they're able to do it, we're not. So a bogus argument on the part of lawyers. Education's part of it, but we need rules from the US Treasury Department, and they're not willing to do it.
Thank you. But I read that even the banks in Switzerland are now much less prepared to accept anonymous money from anonymous sources, and that they have to report back and have agreed to report to the national tax offices. So if that is the case, and you can comment on that, whether that is really becoming as stringent as what one reads partially, but if that is the case, how would I find a bank which accepts my 100 million from Russia? I'm interested in a personal way, as you can realize.
Klaus, I know that you're always looking for funding for your lectures. Well, again, you're good.
Would I accept illegal money?
I don't think history professors are subject to these rules yet. Not yet.
Thanks for pointing that out.
And speaking of which, this scandal about people paying money to coaches to get their kids into school, I mean, the one aspect of it that I don't hear is that universities and colleges have been doing this for years, but they got the money. They put people's names on buildings and then admitted their children. Legacy admissions. It's a whole category. And yet in this particular case, this recent series of cases, the schools got nothing. That's the real scandal. So to go back to your question, we're sitting here in the Krasno lecture series, yes. You can always break up the money, you can always find banks. The Swiss are doing a better job, but that law that you referred to relates to US and citizens with money abroad. That's what they're required to report. It's called FATCA. Don't ask me what it stands for. And it increases laws that have been on the books for years in the US, which require citizens to disclose foreign bank accounts.
Thank you. In your bio, it says several times, expert witness for the IMF, the World Bank, and other organizations. What does that actually mean? What do you do in order to hopefully get a big check from them and help them to counter money laundering cases?
I don't like to tell the competition what I do, but these are civil cases where typically the plaintiff consists of a group of defrauded investors. And the fraudster has put the money in a bank or broker-dealer, and through that bank or broker-dealer has laundered the money stolen from the investors. I'm retained typically by the plaintiffs, the defrauded investors, the victims of the fraud, to institute a case against the bank or broker-dealer to get that money back. And it sounds reasonable, but what the banks and broker-dealers say is, well, the victims were not customers of the bank, and therefore the bank has no responsibility to them. And I'm brought in to talk about red flags and indications of money laundering that were evident. Not proof, not evidence, but indications that the banks should have discovered, the broker-dealers should have discovered themselves, and therefore stop the fraud in its tracks. It's not really for the IMF or World Bank. I did do a case for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Southern District of New York. You've heard of the Southern District of New York a lot lately. It's nicknamed the Sovereign District of New York. They view themselves as among 50 or 75 or 100 U.S. Attorney's offices as being preeminent. When I first started doing work for them, I called friends and said, if you ever have a case before Southern District, give me a call. Now my friends know I'm always looking for business, so they discounted it. But the punchline was, give me a call and I'll tell you to settle, because these people are scary. They're scary good. I told them that I was telling my friends this, and they laughed. I told them that even though we were on the same side, I was afraid of them. Dealing with lawyers there who had photographic memories. would tell me page numbers of depositions for me to look at. They are really, really good. So they're on the front lines, and I was lucky enough to be hired by them to work on this one case. And the case is interesting because it involves an alleged Russian fraud, the same fraud that resulted in the death of Sergei Magnitsky and resulted in the Magnitsky Act. That money that was taken from Russia, fascinating case, because it involved a fraud not on the Russian people per se, but on the Russian Treasury Department. And I don't know, you have to give credit to people who thought this out, because I've never seen anything like it before or since. And the idea was they took over a company owned by a guy named Bill Browder. He's an American who now lives in England. I ran into him at a conference and asked him how he stays alive, since he's pitted himself against Vladimir Putin personally, because Magnitsky worked for Browder, and Browder took it very hard when Magnitsky was killed in a Russian jail. So what the Russians did, as a group of Russians did, is they took over Browder's company, and then they arranged for lawsuits against the Browder's company called Hermitage Fund. No relation to the Hermitage Hotel, just a coincidence. If you've ever been to St. Petersburg and seen the real Hermitage, it's an incredible museum, palace turned museum. They took these fraudulent cases brought by third parties against Hermitage, and then Hermitage, now controlled by Russians, not by Browder, who had fled to England, Hermitage admitted that there was liability in court. This was all done in the space of a day or two. The Russian judge, didn't question any of this and said, oh, you admit it, then boom, you're liable for all this money. Well, that liability created losses in Hermitage. Stay with me. And therefore, Hermitage, under new ownership, claimed for a tax refund from the Russian Treasury, because they said, even though we paid taxes on our profits in the past, we didn't really have those profits. We had all this liability that was assessed against us. With those tax refunds, which came extraordinarily fast, meaning that there were very influential Russians involved in this fraud, because everything happened like clockwork. I mean, imagine getting a refund from the IRS. How long does that take? This was in Russia, and it was done in a matter of days. So now they're loaded with a few $100 million of money, and of course the first thing they want to do is get it out of Russia. And it winds up in the US, and that was the case that I worked on.
Thank you. And what did Browder say, how he stays alive?
He moves around a lot and tries to stay in London, and he was very nice about it. He wasn't surprised at the question. There was security at the conference we were at. I didn't think it was very good security, but evidently he was happy with it. He's still alive.
Thank you. You also fly, or are being asked to fly, to African countries, to Asian countries, to Central or Eastern European countries. So what do people expect you to do there? Because I would assume you mostly don't know the language of the country, so you can't look at treasury documents or finance office documents. So what is your job? How can you be useful?
Well, the language of money is universal.
Okay.
Everybody speaks money. It's green in the US, it's different colors in different countries. The money laundering techniques are the same, the training's the same, the laws are the same, the international standards are the same. So some of what I do is to go around the world and help countries draft laws, help countries train government officials, and answer questions like yours, like why should we stop this money? That's a very common question in a lot of places. Not places that most of us would want to live, but it's a legitimate point. And they would say, well, if bad people, if criminals in our country are laundering money in our own country and buying real estate and developing big projects, isn't that a good thing? Well, you have big projects and you see them, and I've visited some of them, and they're empty, and they're just standing there, and they don't benefit the economy. There's this one-time benefit for the construction. The costs of construction seem odd. The materials are much too opulent. Not as opulent as the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, but still quite opulent. And it's not a net benefit to the country. Mm-hmm. And then the criminals are happy because their money is close by and they can visit it.
Thank you. You did a solid law degree, you told us. And how would you get from that law degree into anti-money laundering, the anti-money laundering business?
How did I get from the law degree to anti-money laundering? Through the IMF.
All right.
Through the IMF. They, in the year 2000, were asked by international bodies to start looking at offshore financial centers because the august heads of these international bodies predicted, this is in 2000 after the Asian crisis of 98, 99, Russia, Thailand, Korea, Indonesia were all suffering from this huge recession. These wise heads wanted to prevent the next crisis. And their prediction was that the next, remember this was in 2000, the next crisis would be generated, the catalyst would be offshore financial centers. So they asked the IMF to start looking closely at OFCs, and in one of the aspects was anti-money laundering, just make sure the frameworks were up to par. Now, of course, the prediction was wrong. The actual cause of 2008, the Great Recession, was a real estate bubble in the US, nothing to do with offshore financial centers. But the result of that international initiative was that the IMF and World Bank, very reluctantly, I should add, got into the anti-money laundering business, and I happened to be there when it happened.
Lucky you. Tell us about the connection between money laundering and international terrorism, and who within the US government would mostly deal with that? Isn't the IRS? It must be the FBI or intelligence agencies. How does that work in order to really trace money laundering cases in and then regarding international terrorism?
Good question. Financing of terrorism and international terrorism, very different from money laundering in one key aspect. Money laundering, we talked about before, always from an illegal activity. Financing terrorism can be legal. Mm-hmm. You worked in Northern Ireland, you may remember at one time.
I was not involved.
But you may remember, I said, Belfast, right? Weren't you in Belfast?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Part of the United Kingdom, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It still is, for the time being.
So what was the question again? So, terrorism, there was a time that the Irish Republican Army terrorist group in Northern Ireland raised money in bars in the US, and Irish Americans and others were happy to give legal money to support what was a terrorist activity. Lots of terrorist activities are supported by legal funds. Hezbollah in Lebanon, largely supported, well, I won't say largely, partially supported by legal funds, partially by criminal funds. The problem, though, even though the same techniques are used to hide the money in the case of financing of terrorism, that is moving the money around and using trade-based money laundering, like used cars. Why would used cars be used to launder money or to hide financing of terrorism? Because nobody knows what the value is. New cars have a sticker. There's an actual objective value. Used cars, who knows? So Hezbollah was caught a few years ago laundering money for terrorist purposes, creating money by selling used cars in Africa. Very complicated thing. So big difference, and very similar, big difference in its origins, the same when it comes to moving the money around to conceal it. Very hard to find. Lots of parts of the US government, the Treasury Department, yes, the FBI, the US Attorney's offices, DEA, virtually every law enforcement, and there are 20 or 30 law enforcement agencies, 17 intelligence agencies are involved in looking at the money. Biggest problem is small money, not large money, not the $200 million in Russia or the $700 million in Malaysia, but the $70,000. You look at the cost of 9/11, it was a pittance. The sending people to learn how to fly planes, tiny amounts of money. What's interesting is there are mostly Saudis, remember, in 9/11. There's nobody from Iraq or Afghanistan. And what the Saudis did when they entered the US is they declared the cash they were bringing with them. It was in excess of $10,000, which is required under US law. They followed the law, and the response was a Saudi student coming in with a lot of cash. This is not news, not worth looking at. So they were able to get the money in, but small amounts.
Thank you. Before opening it up to questions from the audience, can you tell us one interesting case without naming names or locations you were yourself involved in, which was particularly interesting and illuminating?
It's hard to do because the cases are so specific, but I can tell you some anecdotes. My favorite one is what happened to me for my first expert witness case, which was a classic fraud, stealing money from a trust fund. And I was working for the lawyers for the plaintiff, so they call me one day and they say, we're sending you another civil action. Will you read it? You know, people pay me to read this stuff, but still, like, why am I reading this? Just read it. You'll know why when you read it. So I read the case, and the case is Smith versus Mr. Fraudster. Wait a minute, this is the same fraudster we have in our case. Who's Smith? So Smith is the plaintiff, and he's suing the fraudster. So something bad happened. And complaints, civil complaints, are stories. There can be interesting stories. They tell you a story. And the story was Mr. Smith was incarcerated in prison with Mr. Fraudster, and they became friends. And when Mr. Smith was released from prison, and Mr. Fraudster was released from prison, Mr. Smith invested in real estate with Mr. Fraudster. And guess what happened? He lost the money. Now wait a minute. You can't make this stuff up. Two felons become friends. The fraudster was there because of real estate fraud. He would have told that to his cellmate. I mean, it's nothing to be ashamed of, right?
Of course not.
But in prison, this is the way he made his money. And yet, this other criminal, or former criminal, invested money. So you can't make this stuff up. Criminals do interesting things every day. They didn't all go to the best colleges, like Chapel Hill. Some of them are quite smart, others not so smart. So they can be caught, and when they're caught, they always do interesting things. But I really do think that this audience looks like they have lots of questions.
They have. Thank you very much indeed. Let's open it up. Let's start with this gentleman here, right here at the corner.
The Hermitage case that you discussed.
Can I also ask you to perhaps stand up, then it's better for the camera.
And if you could tell us your name and social security number, that would be Sits down, okay.
Is this on? This is not.
Yeah, that's right.
The Hermitage case that you described sounded nasty, but I didn't hear anything illegal. What was illegal about it?
Okay, good. The illegality was the fact that the company owned by Will Browder, Hermitage, was taken over illegally in Russia. And then, that's illegal. And then it was stolen. There was a raid on the company, and the corporate seals were taken, and the employees were told to go home if they weren't already running away. Browder wrote a really good book about this. I think it was called Red Notice, which detailed all of this. And so he brought a lot of the employees with him to London. He paid for them to leave the country. So the first illegality was taking over the company. The second illegality was the fraudulent cases being brought. They weren't real cases. The third illegality was the participation of the courts in those cases, not asking any questions. In a real court, the case would have been dismissed. Like, this isn't a real case. Where's the other side? You're not going to argue against this case. You're just going to give up. Why would you do that? Nobody does that. And then there was another layer of illegality when the tax authorities refunded the money overnight without asking questions. And another layer when the money was sent out of Russia. So there's lots of illegality there. Not the kind of illegality that involves the normal kind of corruption, but certainly stealing from the Russian treasury is a form of corruption.
Thank you. The lady, did I see a lady over there? No? This gentleman here, David Lind.
David Lind. It seems to me there's probably a class of crimes that are associated with, or require money laundering, or at least function because of money laundering, that there's an international agreement that these are bad things to get at. Human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, stolen antiquities and art, especially done by criminal groups or terrorist groups. And that getting at the money laundering aspects of these crimes will require international cooperation. We've seen a lot in the news today about the crumbling of international cooperation, credibility of the United States and its role in international cooperation. To what extent is any decline in America's role in this going to affect our ability to get at money laundering to the extent that we've been able to do it at all today?
It's a really good question. Let's take it into pieces. The first piece is there's a class of crimes that involves money laundering. But it really is any fraud or any illegal activity that generates money. And the crimes that you named generate lots of money. Trafficking of any kind generates amazing amounts of money. Human trafficking, the profits are crazy high. So yes, it requires the cooperation often of many countries, and yes, it requires prosecutors, law enforcement to cooperate. On the working level, I don't think much has changed. But to the extent that the US is attacking other countries, including countries that I always thought were our allies, like the EU, that does make life harder for prosecutors and law enforcement, and other countries less likely to cooperate, but always a tough sell. Always a tough sell. It's a complicated issue. Hezbollah in Lebanon is legal. Hezbollah is the leading political party in Lebanon. It's also a leading social welfare organization, hospitals and food distribution. So, not a terrorist organization in Lebanon, its home base, but considered so outside, including many countries in the Middle East, like Jordan. I talked to a group of Jordanian, very small group of Jordanian policemen. It was the last day of their study tour, and they were tired. They'd been up all night, and they didn't know why I was there, and I wasn't sure either. And I hear a discussion in Arabic. I've got an interpreter, but the interpreter is silent. So I asked them, what's so funny? Because they're laughing about something in Arabic. The punchline of the joke still mystifies me, but the punchline was, "We will cut off the head of your mother." And I said, well, what's funny about that? Well, this is something that terrorists often threaten when they kidnap you. But what's the joke? Well, somehow they couldn't explain it, but it was very funny. So it's not an easy part of the world. And the people who engage in these activities on the law enforcement side, pretty tough characters. I think the woman next to you had a question.
Yes.
Can we get a microphone?
So the end result of money laundering may result in a beneficiary entity, like a church, a school, a orphanage. So what happens to that money once has been ascertained that the money was laundered? They needs to be given back, needs to be returned, or is it immoral for the organization that received it thinking it was a legal donation? How should society deal with this, in your opinion?
Really good questions. I don't like the audience very much because these are very tough questions as well. Plus, you didn't tell me that I would get such tough questions, right? First, yes, some of the money goes to charitable purposes, but not the kinds of money we're talking about from corruption. Very little of it goes to charity. If criminal financiers wanted to contribute to charity, they could do that in their own countries. They wouldn't need to take the money and funnel it around the world and transfer it from bank to bank. It tends not to go in these large amounts. The cartels in Mexico are famous for their social welfare activities, but I've never heard of a case where the money has been recovered.
It's the movie The Godfather that makes me think of that. Because eventually money was given to the widows and the families to help them, and the money.
It's a great movie. I don't think that's the scale of what we're talking about. Yes, there were criminal organizations in the U.S. and yes, they did some good things, but that money typically wasn't recovered from churches or orphanages. No, those are not cases that would have been brought. Prosecutors have huge amounts of discretion. Those aren't the cases that would have been brought, certainly that I'm aware of.
Okay.
So you don't have to worry about UNC.
Thank you. Over there, yes, right at the end. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Can you stand up, please?
Yep, sure. Two questions. One point, I was surprised that you said the British were more robust in anti-money laundering than the U.S. And I thought that the legislation had actually changed just recently in terms of the real estate market, and that it was under Theresa May. So I think maybe different if you're a politically exposed person, and it was always the case that they would go for you, but otherwise it was like going to Vegas and everything. So that was one thing about maybe contrasting and comparing the UK. And secondly, I suppose one could make a case that the parabolic move in digital assets, Bitcoin and the like, 3 or 4 years ago, was a paradise for money launderers. I was just curious as to your thoughts.
Thank you.
So the answers are no and yes. No, the UK has had more robust laws generally. I wasn't speaking just of civil forfeiture, but for example, covering lawyers and real estate agents for years, going back years, and getting suspicious activity reports from them. They call them suspicious activity reports. The civil forfeiture law, you're right, is relatively new, and the U.S. has had its law for years. But the overall framework in the UK has been more robust than the US for a number of years. So I guess, yeah, if you just look at civil forfeiture, the US has been doing a better job over time, but surprising that the UK would, and you're right, is just in the last few years, would make such a concerted effort to go after Russian money in particular, because that was inflating the London real estate market to a huge degree. Cryptocurrency gave a seminar on this today here at the business school, Keenan Center.
Keenan Flagler.
Keenan Flagler. It's a great way to move money. It's a great way to launder money. It's a great way to, there are all sorts of frauds that are premised in cryptocurrency, like initial coin offerings. ICOs are as high as 70 or 80% to be considered to be frauds. It's a new avenue for laundering money that's very troubling, and the US and other governments are struggling to catch up. So that's the yes.
Thank you. Here, over there.
Hi,
Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Thank you. English is not my first language. My first language is Ukrainian. And I live in New York City, and I'm actually writing a book on New York City now. But there's been, I have seen hundreds of millions of dollars allegedly laundered. You know, and it was done within the Ukrainian American community, because I figured that everybody over there had to have somebody over here. And I've overheard conversations. And the thing that struck me was how people brag about this. And there's a woman that somebody tried to introduce me to help her, and I do very good background checks, and she came after the Euromaidan. She managed the plaza where the demonstrations took over, and now she brags on Facebook that she laundered 300, well, she doesn't say laundered, but she said, I sold $750 million worth of real estate since 2014.
Sold it in New York?
In New York and London.
Right.
And then she was on The Voice of America, you know, being broadcast as a successful businesswoman who came over from over there. Now, I've seen this happen multiple times, and there's a whole infrastructure. I mean, I've seen prominent people in Canada who are now in government there, you know, enabling these people. And you know, it's so if you read the testimony of Ambassador Taylor, he met Ambassador Teft at a Pinchuk event in Kiev, and that guy, I was told how he launders money. You know, I mean, this is, you know, I'm actually friends with the prosecutor of Ukraine, and I'm trying to tell them to establish some kind of presence in places like New York, because, you know, that's where the money circulates, and you have to have some kind of eyes and ears. Am I correct in that?
So can I give yes or no answers, because it's getting late? Yes. I mean, certainly you're right that the scale is very high. Certainly it involves former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, not limited to Ukraine, but including Ukraine. Certainly large amounts of money. Is it known? I mean, the prosecutors have to target what they can prove. They like to win cases. They don't bring cases they think they're going to lose just to send a message. They want to win. And settlements are considered wins. So if the case is settled for X dollars, that's considered a win. Because when you win in that kind of civil case, all you get is money. So if you're talking about criminal prosecutions, much tougher. Much tougher rules, much tougher chain of evidence, very hard to prove. I don't know the specifics of the facts that you talked about, but having somebody brag about being a great business person is a normal sort of thing.
Thank you. What?
I mean, you have to look at the context, right?
Again, it's not hard to find these cases. Proving the cases is the hard part. Finding them isn't the hard part.
And prosecutors in certain countries don't have the best reputation either, I believe.
I would rather not comment if you don't mind.
No, that was just a statement. Not
Yeah.
The guy to the very left here. Yeah. It's a lady, sorry.
Actually, non-binary, so it doesn't matter. So you mentioned that kind of one of the biggest blind spots in the U.S. is the lack of regulations for money laundering with respect to lawyers and real estate, et cetera. But I'm wondering just in general how much regulations actually matter and to what extent they matter. Like, for the regulations on the banks, like what are they looking for? Presumably somewhere down the line, someone has to say, hey, I was just approached by a Russian oligarch for like to take an investment of $100 million. They could just go out and do that and not report it. So like what matters in regulations is that the regulation itself or like the monitoring system in place, like are there auditors? So I'm kind of wondering about the minutiae of that with respect to the banking regulations that are in place. And the same thing for lawyers and real estate. Like what are you even looking for in those cases that you regulate?
Okay, good question. Is regulation enough? No, but without it, you don't really have a starting point. So it's necessary, but not sufficient. Banks have been subject to these rules for years. They don't always do a good job, but they do report 1 million or so cases of suspicious activities every year, and some of those reports lead to investigations and prosecutions. And all of them form a body of material that is used for law enforcement every day. So, and remember also that part of this regulatory scheme is the reporting of suspicious transactions. Just because there's a regulation, does it mean that lawyers and real estate agents are going to report? No, but it would mean that they would be sanctioned for not reporting. They would be penalized for not reporting. They'd be subject to civil money penalties, criminal penalties, other types of penalties. They could be banned from their profession as well. So there are serious penalties on one side, but there has to be a regulation at the beginning. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Any more questions here? Yes, this gentleman here.
You mentioned how the United States is a great investment opportunities for all these foreign funds. Are there any estimates of what percent of the growth of our economy is a result of the inflow?
Really good question. It's illegal, really bad statistics. There are statistics about the percentage of global GDP that is related to money laundering. I'm not going to tell you what the percentage is because one, I don't remember it, and two, it comes from a speech by an IMF managing director that ballparked, I think it was Kamdassu years ago, and he ballparked a number that came out of the air. It wasn't meant to be the standard percentage for all time. It was just kind of a guess. Economists don't like to make those kinds of guesses.
You have a guess. You're a lawyer. You have a guess.
I can guess.
Have a guess.
The percentage from the U.S. economy from illegal activities, including money laundering?
Yes.
Oh boy. I think I couldn't answer that except to say that if you're looking at the higher end of real estate, in not just New York, but in places like Los Angeles, San Antonio,
Miami.
Thank you, Miami. There's a list of these in something called the Geographic Targeting Order, but that's put out by a unit of the U.S. Treasury Department. If you look at those higher end real estate deals, a certain percentage, yes, would be money laundering. I would say at the higher end, 10 to 20%. It's just a guess though. At the very high end, the 10, 50, $100 million purchases, much higher percentage would be money laundering. But it's a guess. Because it's criminal activity, we don't have good statistics, never will.
Thank you, the gentleman here.
Thank you. How do you feel on the view that the U.S. gains a strategic advantage from being the bank or the target country of choice for all this laundered money? And what I mean by that is when we choose to put sanctions on a country like Russia, we immediately freeze the funds of the major oligarchs from Russia as a way of putting pain points off Russia.
It's an interesting point. It's a good question. The sanctions you're talking about are OFAC sanctions. They're done for purposes of foreign policy. They're not done for money laundering purposes or crime.
But having pain points available.
But because they're investing in U.S. dollars, the U.S. has this leverage that it wouldn't have otherwise. I think that's what you're saying.
Correct.
It's an interesting point. I think there'd be plenty of leverage because the U.S. is still the reserve currency, even without those investments. Everybody wants access to U.S. dollars, and not having that access to U.S. dollars is considered a pretty serious blow for the oligarchs and others. So, yeah, are the sanctions increased because they're already here? Yeah, that's probably true. I think that's a good point. It's probably true.
Thank you. The lady over there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for speaking with us. So you conceded that a large chunk, or at least a sizable chunk, of our country's GDP and potentially other countries' GDPs are from money laundering, and that.
Did I concede that? Can we play back the tape?
Okay. Let me rephrase that. So if money laundering does in some way improve the GDP of a country, it would seem that a smaller country would be incentivized to allow money laundering to occur. How do you convince a country to crack down on this kind of money laundering and fraud? And is that part of your job? If so, how do you do it?
Again, these are very good questions and very tough questions. Yes, smaller countries have a really tough time. Countries dealing with their own domestic terrorist groups, for example, are loath to pass terrorist financing laws because those laws are viewed by the domestic terror groups. I don't want to name countries, but they're viewed, for example, in the Middle East, but not just in the Middle East, also in Asia. They're viewed as being attacks on the terrorist group, and that causes the terrorist group to be more active. The government is targeting them by passing a law on the financing of terrorism. But your question is broader than that. You convince them through a push and a pull. The international community has a system of gray listing countries that don't comply with these international standards. Countries that are gray listed have a lot of trouble getting money out of their country, getting investments, legal investments, into their country. It's a real burden for those countries. Most tend to try to get off those lists. So that's one way. The other way is, again, fear of being taken over by the cartels, by criminal groups, by drug trafficking organizations. It's the control of the money is something that governments worry about all over the world. Control of the money in their country by criminals is something that countries worry about. But it happens in every country, large and small.
Thank you. There's time for a few more questions. This gentleman here.
Yes, hello, Ponomarov. I have a question that relates to yours. Switzerland used to be the haven for billions for corrupt dictators. You mentioned Suharto from Indonesia and others who had their secret number accounts, the secrecy jurisdiction in the Swiss financial system. And then in the early mid-1990s, Switzerland was at the forefront of the Financial Action Task Force, the OECD in Paris. I think Mark Piet was the chairman of that task force and law professor in Basel. How did this change of mind come about?
Can I ask if you're Swiss?
I'm German.
Okay.
But my ancestors are Swiss, it wasn't.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise of your question that starting in the 1990s, the Swiss have started to get tougher on all of this. The cases I've seen that involve Swiss banks are fairly recent. So that's not, I view the Swiss as being a reluctance in all of this. They were considered an offshore financial center. They took great umbrage in the year 2000 when we visited with them, because I was part of that group at the IMF, and they said, we're not offshore. How can you call us an offshore financial center? And what about all you big onshore financial centers? Why aren't you being targeted? New York and London. Valid question. But, so dating back 25, 30 years to the 90s, no. Recent years, yes. A greater focus by the Swiss, a greater concern by the Swiss. But I mean, the US doesn't do a great job in a lot of ways. Many countries have trouble with this. I think I want to leave it at that without getting too much more specific.
Thank you very much. There were some more questions here. Yeah, over there.
Is this the way your students get exercise class? They run around with microphones?
I can catch it. I was wondering whether the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers have created a web through the fraud community that is enlightening as to whether this has scaffolded aggressive actions, or is it more minor? Is it confined to certain types of fraud, money laundering?
Right. Impact? It's a good question. Most of the cases, I'm more familiar with the Panama Papers than the Paradise Papers, but most of those cases involve tax evasion. People hiding money from tax authorities. Everyone knows it's been going on for years, but it's forced countries to confront the problem. And I think it hasn't informed them that there is a problem. It's forced them to confront the problem with respect to specific transactions, specific individuals. In that sense, a good thing. It's laid the groundwork for investigations. Again, a good thing. Not news, though, that this has been going on. Countries have known it's been going on for years.
Thank you. We are exhausting you with our questions. And we will have a couple of more questions and then we'll...
One or two.
Yes, one or two. Let's say two.
We're exhausting the audience. They look pretty exhausted today.
No, you look more exhausted.
Thank you, class.
You're welcome. Anyway,
these are my friends.
Who would like to ask another almost final question? Yes, penultimate final question.
Evening. I'd like to know what specific policy or legislative changes would you suggest to strengthen the nation's resolve or resilience against laundering?
Here in the U.S.?
Correct.
Well, again, these are all good questions. I'd start with the regulatory actions by Vincent for real estate, lawyers, registered investment advisors, hedge funds. They can do all that by regulation. They don't need more legislation to do that. That would be the first point. The second point would be something that I just mentioned very, very briefly in the discussion of money laundering, trade-based money laundering. There's no international recommendation on trade-based money laundering. There are 40 recommendations that cover this wide panoply of things government should do. Nothing about trade-based money laundering. The U.S. has nothing about trade-based money laundering. So that would be a second thing. The third thing would be to get serious about investigations and prosecutions here in the U.S., starting with U.S. political figures. Okay, this is going to be misinterpreted. Let me back up. In anti-money laundering parlance, there's something called a politically exposed person, a PEP. The international standard is when a politically exposed person, that is, an official of a government, a political party, an international organization, opens up a bank account, that bank account should get enhanced scrutiny. That's the international standard. What the U.S. has done is a double watering down of that standard. First they say it's only going to apply for accounts of $1 million or more where there's a relationship manager. And then in those narrow cases, we're going to require this enhanced scrutiny. Total departure from the standard. So all the politically exposed person has to do is open up two $500,000 accounts at different banks, and they escape that scrutiny. There's one other aspect to PEPs, and again, I don't want you to misinterpret this into things going on in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Just generally speaking with anti-money laundering.
Don't be so careful, we're a small group.
Thanks, Clark. Thank you. So, I don't want this to go viral, okay? So, the latest international standard on PEPs is that domestic PEPs, for the first time, are subject to the same enhanced scrutiny. What has the U.S. done? Crickets, nothing. So on the one hand, it watered down the standard for foreign PEPs. On the other hand, done nothing for domestic PEPs. Who are domestic PEPs? Well, they'd be members of Congress, they'd be mayors, they'd be anybody with a purse string of any size at any level. Judges, heads of political parties. We know in the case of most government employees, including Congress, we know their salaries. So when they go to open up a bank account, if they're depositing the amount of their salary in one transaction, we know that's a lot of money for them. And therefore, we should be asking, what's the source of wealth in that case? No requirement in the U.S. to do that. Other countries are starting to implement this. Does that help?
Yes.
Thank you very much. One final question. Who is sacrificing him or herself? Yes, there is a courageous person.
I'll ask a real quick yes or no just for the group or whatever, but so up from Fort Bragg, I was flipping through the bill that just recently got passed, and kind of his point about rules and what you were talking about earlier, it kind of states in there in section C about like the penalties for that and the beneficiaries and the 25% stakeholders, which they could just put that out through a bunch of different companies. And then the penalties in there were 3 years, $10K, and if it was negligent, they aren't even go after them. So, I mean, is that political window dressing, or is that even doing something?
It's a good question. I don't think that bill was enacted. I think it might have been...
Just passed in the House.
Right, but not enacted.
Right.
So it takes, as you know, Senate and House and the signature of the President. There's been a greater focus on beneficial ownership. I don't think it's enough because we still allow states to issue corporate charters without asking any questions. As long as we do that, the beneficial ownership rules are going to be shrouded in secrecy. So that's the biggest problem, is that the states have all of this leeway, and we seem to have elected officials from all these states, and they really want to protect their states. There's a lot of fee income that gets generated from the sale of these charters. And somehow, I don't know where this happened, hundreds of years ago, somebody got the idea that you could protect investors by having this intermediary legal entity, a corporation. And you could protect the investors so they could invest in this endeavor, and then if it went south, nobody could come after the individual investors, they could just come after the company. Great idea, brilliant. Part of the growth of capitalism and free markets. But I don't remember anything that said, and those investors will be secret. I just don't know where that came from. But somehow it's gotten enshrined in our consciousness that wealthy people deserve to have anonymous companies. That's all in our heads. That's the first thing that should go when it comes to beneficial ownership.
Thank you very much. I very much get the impression your own job is very much secure for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much for enlightening us.